Thank you to everyone in the room. It is an honor to be here, an honor to be in a city like Paris with great friends and great debaters on side opposition. Now, I never thought it would be this hard to convince Brits that their country rules the world, that they matter. I never thought it would take this much time. But I think the problem is we've been debating the wrong thing. I think what they wanted us to say was that the United Kingdom rules the world of, like, tea consumption. And you know what? Maybe we should debate that, because then I think the round would be over. But I think Cambridge has made a mistake. I think the mistake that they've made is, well, until the last speaker anyhow, like their tea, they've left their arguments in the corner. And so here is a number of the problems that they've come up with. The first is sort of interpreting why we should debate, why we should be having this discussion. And they've done two things, basically, that I think are very interesting. First of all, they said that the British Empire doesn't exist. So if the British Empire doesn't exist, obviously it cannot rule the world, but why would we even be debating about it anyhow? And I think this is something you've heard consistently from Yale, that it must, in some form, exist. But I think we also never get a discussion as to if it does exist, in what capacity does that form take place. And from the very beginning of our speech, we defined what the British themselves called their empire. When they changed it to a commonwealth, they started defining those terms, those countries, as a commonwealth itself. But then I think we have another interesting argument that comes out. They try and tell us what rules the world. They say maybe it's your military, maybe it's your industry. Our last speaker tells us that maybe it's a bunch of other countries. Maybe it's the United States, maybe it's China, maybe it's Russia. But I think they're all hitting at something here. That it might be hard to define what rules the world, because in a globalized world, it is very hard to rule it in the way that we are used to a country ruling the world. No, thank you, not at this time. And I think if we assume that someone or somehow you can rule the world, because again, why would you be debating about whether a country can rule the world if it is not possible? Then we have to think about what that means in the world today. And I think if no one country can do it, if no country like the United States or China, and we'll give you reasons why we don't think those countries can, have done it, no thank you, not at this time, then we have to ask ourselves what it is. And what Yale has been arguing is that it is shaping the world, shaping the way that the world works, creating the system that dictates how everything else happens in the world. Because a lot of the things that they've been talking about, military structure, the structure of politics and economics, things like environment, all of those things are contingent on the system or the structure that makes them. And if you have laid down that system, and if that system is still played out in how the world works today, then you have had a profound impact on the world. So much so that if you are a precursor to everything else that happens, or a large portion of what happens, one could even say that you rule it. And I think that is what we have been talking about today. That is how we are trying to interpret emotion that is interesting in itself, but I think has led to a potential for a great debate. But why do we think that this is better than what they've told you? Sure, I'll take you.
Are you suggesting we change the meaning of British Empire and then change the meaning of rule and then we vote in favor of the motion?
No. What I'm saying is that the British Empire, as it exists today, is something that your former Prime Minister actually defined as the British Commonwealth, which we've already discussed. And then we're also saying that it is not possible to rule the world with a gun. And let me give you some examples actually, because this is one of the two things you give us as what rules the world. You talk about military might. I come from a country that has a very strong military. I'm very proud of that military. Except in all the things that it's done wrong, which, sadly, is a fairly large list. It doesn't do very well in places like Afghanistan, or Iraq, or Vietnam, or Iran, or trying to use its military influence to scare countries like North Korea, or Lebanon, or Nicaragua, or Sudan, or Somalia. The list goes on and on. But military might does not, at least from the perspective of the most powerful country in the world, rule the world any longer. But then they say, well, maybe it's industry. No, thank you. They say, well, if it's industry, then maybe there's a fairly strong argument that a country like China rules the world. But there are a bunch of reasons to think why this isn't the case. First of all, as Nate told you in his POI, the money that funds Chinese operations, that invests all of that money into Chinese businesses, those countries that are going in are multinational companies. Many of them are either from the United Kingdom or run their money through the largest banks in the world, which are all based in the United Kingdom and collectively control tens of trillions of dollars in assets. To put that in perspective, the GDP of the United States of America, $13 trillion, pales in comparison to the holdings and the influence that those types of banks, RBS, Barclays, hold. No wonder they were so important. No wonder, as I'm guessing you're about to ask me, they almost brought the world down. But no, thank you. So I think that that's an important thing to consider. But the other important thing to consider is what ultimately changes the way people live their lives. What ultimately changes outcomes in the world. We've already told you it's probably not the military might of the United States, and how that's failed so many times. It's probably also not the might of a country like China, which really only cares about its domestic affairs, that doesn't try to influence the internal affairs of other nations, that doesn't try to rule over them in that sense, because it's really only concerned with maintaining power, the Chinese Communist Party. We think what does actually rule the world is changing is sort of influencing the agenda or influencing the way that the world runs. And we've given you a lot of reasons to think that the British Commonwealth is the primary reason or the primary facet of this in the world today. So Meredith talked to you a lot about how common law, like the Western conception of law, is based on the British model, which is different than Napoleon or different than the Roman Empire because it still exists and it is still used today in numbers of countries across the world. Also, we've talked about how the economic system, the nature of markets, of having stock exchanges, those are all British creations, which, guess what, are still used in the world today. The same goes for education. The same goes for something small that we might not be, we might be forgetting. English, like the language of the United Kingdom, which is something that influences the entire nature of business, the entire nature of politics and of diplomacy, all done in the English language. But I also think that in the future, and today, when we're talking about the biggest policy questions that face the world, it is the United Kingdom and the British Commonwealth as a body that has the most influence. When it comes to development, trying to build countries, like India, for example, the largest democracy in the world, also one of the largest economic centers in the world, is an excellent example of how the Commonwealth is impacting one of the largest issues that faces the world today. How to deal with overpopulation and develop poor countries, bringing people out of poverty and bringing them away from things like disease. But we also think that the British Commonwealth is very important when it comes to promoting the idea of economic stability. They keep talking about the financial crisis of 2008. Well, it's interesting that the countries that weathered the storm the best, the stable economies that we'd like to talk about, many of them are part of the Commonwealth. Canada, Australia, Singapore, Malaysia, New Zealand, as small and as many sheep as it might have, it still did a good job of weathering the storm. And finally, on the issue of world peace, it's only a week or two ago that the United Kingdom decided to go on a path to disarm its entire nuclear program. Like, these things matter in shaping the policy outcomes in the world. These things are still happening in the British Empire. But most importantly, the way that the world runs, all the systems that are sort of created by the British Empire still dictate how the world makes its decisions day to day. That's what impacts people's lives, and that is what we should consider when we consider what rules the world. Thank you.